Well, welcome back. Hope you all enjoyed the break. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about how we take good ideas and good technologies into great companies. I think a lot of us have probably seen some of the challenges with great technologies that never actually go anywhere, or great ideas that have trouble getting traction. So at Imperial Innovations, we try to focus really on what is it that builds a great company. And that's what I'll talk about today. So first, just a little introduction to who we are. Imperial Innovations, as the name might indicate, began as the tech transfer office at Imperial College nearly 20 years ago. Like probably many of you, we came to realize that in commercializing early stage technologies, it's often helpful, very helpful, to have access to capital. And so in the early 2000s, Imperial Innovations was spun out of Imperial College and raised some public funding. A few years later, we listed on AIM and raised additional funding, and then brought in Russ Cummings as our CIO, our Chief Investment Officer. He had spent 15 years at 3i and Scottish Equity Partners, and he began to build a venture capital investing mentality in our group. Today, we have both a technology transfer office that still works exclusively with Imperial College, and then we also have a venture capital group. And our venture capital group invests widely across the UK with a focus around the Golden Triangle, comprising Oxford, Cambridge, and Imperial, and UCL as well. So we still focus on university technologies, but we've also come to recognize that often great companies have relationships to universities, but those relationships can come in many different forms. We are a very wide breadth of stage for investment. We'll actually start at £25,000 seed check, just sometimes to do some proof of concept experiments or some market research to see if a technology has the potential that we think it may. And then we'll invest to follow our companies all the way into those later stages of development, sometimes leading a £40 million Series C. We currently have over £200 million in cash. We invest off of our balance sheet. And so we're actively looking for novel and disruptive companies into which to deploy that capital. It's been a very exciting year for us. We've actually had 4 of our companies IPO in this past year. Oxford Immunotech IPO'd on NASDAQ in the US. And Circassia, which is one of our flagship companies, is an allergy pharmaceutical, IPO'd in London on the main market and is currently trading at a valuation around $1 billion. That's the type of thing that we want to do. Our corporate mission statement is to build the next generation of UK-based global technology companies. And so hopefully that helps you understand a little bit more about the focus that we take in analyzing technologies and entrepreneurs and early stage companies. I myself joined Imperial Innovations about 2 years ago, partly because of this focus. I was really attracted to the mission of building the next generation of big companies, primarily from the very earliest stages. I'm an engineer by training, and I worked in California at a venture firm called Fire Lake Capital for a number of years, in addition to some other operating roles. And I have come to really enjoy that stage of shaping the early stage companies, figuring out who are the different personnel that are needed. I've experienced, and I imagine many of you have as well, that in Europe, finding early stage venture investors is very difficult. And so when I moved here, I was really attracted to the few players I could find in the market that were willing to take that early stage risk, both in technology and in financial investment. I laugh sometimes that many of the venture capital investors in London say that they only invest in companies that are in profit, significant revenue and profit. And I personally beg whether that's really the definition of venture capital. So I am pleased that we start at the very early stages, and we look to partner with other investors that also work at those very early stages. So what do we look for when we're investing in early stage technologies? Fundamentally, we look for 3 criteria, and actually this is not even taking away the venture perspective, the venture hat for a moment. In spinning technologies out of a university, I think there's 3 critical elements. The one that is most commonly observed is the IP and the technical ability. Universities are world leaders in technical ability and with innovative ideas around technology, which is often patentable and leads to some very strong IP. So we do look for kind of a sound basis in IP and technical ability that goes along with that IP. IP on its own is not worth nearly as much as IP with one or two, for instance, PhDs or postdocs, or a senior academic advisor who want to continue to engage with a spin-out company. Of course, we want the people involved in the company to have passion and desire, and that's a really critical element. Just this summer, we turned down a company that we'd been working with for a little while because we got the impression that the academics weren't really sure if they wanted to do it. And so that's a very critical element. Again, those of you that are entrepreneurs know how many ups and downs there are. I was talking to an entrepreneur recently, and he explained that he'd been driving somewhere where it didn't have cell phone reception, and he turned back on his phone, and he had a whole series of voicemails that, you know, good news, bad news, good news, bad news. And he's like, just by being out of reception, I avoided the entire roller coaster of the day. And again, I'm sure many of you can identify with that. And so we really look for a passion and desire in our entrepreneurs. But at the end of the day, the most fundamental thing that we look for is what is the commercial reason for the commercialization of the technology. And we really look at that from a whole number of different perspectives. So who is the customer going to be? What do the channels look like to that customer? Is this something where the customers are willing to adopt new technology, or they're 5 steps away, and this is a component that's 11th on their top 10 list of things they care about? So we try to really dig into who cares about this, how much do they care about it, and do they care enough to pay? So if you have a technology that's coming out of the university, they often, a first step is, okay, we want to commercialize this technology. How do we get some finances, some funding to get this going? And there's a variety of different options to do that. I personally am a huge fan of early revenues. I think that if you have the option of getting early revenues, it's a great way to get started. It can show, it can help sustain the company. It can show potential investors that there is customer interest. There's a balance, of course. You don't want to sell anything or everything or get too distracted in getting early revenues that don't have to do with the core of the business. But if the technology can be quickly commercialized to get early revenues, very valuable. And today, there's more opportunities than ever around customer financing. Traditionally, maybe you could get a loan from your first customer, but today, there's some really great crowdfunding opportunities around rewards-based crowdfunding like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, where you can actually put your proposed product up, and right then you can actually evaluate customer interest, especially if it's a consumer product. So it's another great way to get financing. There's grants, and there's angel investing, and in the angel investing space, we're also seeing some innovation around crowdfunding. Platforms like AngelList or Seedrs or Crowdcube are providing companies different ways to get angel investing rather quickly, or more quickly than previous. And then, of course, there's venture investing. And I think one thing to remember is that so many spin-outs immediately start evaluating angel investing and venture investing for funding, but really it's only appropriate for a small fraction of technologies. So, if you are a technology that thinks you can get early revenues or customer financing, I'd definitely encourage you. And then if you decide to go with venture funding later, it can be easier to do that because you've got your market more proven. There's one other thing that's worth mentioning. So we're talking quite a bit about spin-outs from university technology. And then, of course, you can also just do a direct license with university technology. And you can do a hybrid, which is creating a spin-out that then licenses the technology. As a venture investor, I have some concerns with that particular business model in terms of providing venture funding into a company that's then going to license the technology. And the fundamental reason for that is because you, as the startup, lose control over the ultimate end product. You're putting the fate of the product, your destiny, into somebody else's hands. So a lot of companies I talk to think that it may be just an easy route to market is to license the technology to a partner who will then commercialize it. And that can be a compelling route to market, especially if you can get the right partner and the right terms. But there are some challenges that come along with that. I'll go through this quite quickly. This is a slide that our Chief Investment Officer put together, and I thought it did a really great job of calling out some of the different sectors in the startup world and some of the different characteristics. So on the lower left here, we have specific sectors: digital, software, internet startups, which really it's all about a scale or fail game. And on the right side, we have technologies that take a much longer time to develop, to commercialize. Revenues are much further out, greater capital needs, slower to market, and those investors need to have a much longer time horizon. As an entrepreneur, I think it's really critical to understand the differences between those two types of investors, those two types of startups, and then those two types of investors, because it is very challenging if you're a materials company to have an investor who wants to get out in 2 years. So I'd take that into consideration when engaging with different investors. And I'd like to take a moment now to talk about what we as venture investors specifically look for when deciding to venture back an early stage opportunity. We've talked about markets. It needs to be a big market, especially if we want to build a company that's going to be a billion-dollar company, the next generation of global technology companies. It needs to have a big market. And that market needs to have several characteristics around willingness to adopt new technology and channels into it and ability to maintain a reasonable gross margin as opposed to getting squeezed. The technology itself needs to be quite disruptive. Again, if the technology or the startup wants to capture significant gross margins, that technology needs to be really disruptive. And one of the jokes we made a lot when I was in California is that the biggest enemy of startups is the good enough problem. If your customers have a solution that is good enough, it's really hard to get in there. And so you have to have something that is much, much better. And we ideally look for better in two ways: cost and performance. So a lot of times technologies will have one or the other, but we find that it's really, if you can have both, then it becomes more of a no-brainer for your customers. And hopefully you can get around the good enough problem. Needs to be protectable in IP. You can get a lot of Me Too follow-ons. And then you need to have a commercialization mindset. So wanting to take it, and again, this is particularly challenging sometimes with academic teams, understanding that, okay, the lifeblood of the company is getting this into the market. We definitely look for strong teams, and that's often very complementary teams. So both, a complementary executive team that has multifacets, as well as a board that plays a nice balance, both the executive team and then within the board. And if we have time during the Q&A, I can talk a little bit more about specific characteristics within individuals that we look for in creating strong teams. But that's something that I, as a venture investor, it's probably one of the only levers that I have on helping a company be great. I'm never going to understand the technology as well as the team, probably not the markets, but helping them, recognize how to build a great team is an important characteristic. And then lastly, financing strategy, I believe, is probably one of the most underestimated, under-recognized, important characteristics for spin-outs. Both in the US, but especially here in Europe and here in the UK. A lot of times we'll meet with a seed company. I remember just talking to an entrepreneur a few months ago who said he was raising £2 million. And I asked, why £2 million? And he said, well, I think that's the most anyone will give me. And I appreciated his honesty, but we really look for a level of analysis much deeper than that. So what are the different milestones necessary, especially if you're, going back a few slides to where we had the different sectors. If you're on the right side and you know that you're going to need a few rounds of capital to get to market, what are the exact milestones that are necessary at each one of those rounds that then unlock a new round of capital from a new investor? I'm very impressed when an entrepreneur comes into me and says, I'm raising this much here, and it's going to accomplish this, which then puts us into position to raise this much from these people, because this is what they look for when making that investment decision. And that strategy is a really critical element in helping companies not become zombies or go through subsequent rounds of down rounds and capital starvation. So I think that is something that's critical within our companies, but at the same time, it's also something that we can work with them. As venture investors, we believe that actually, when we're looking for the companies, these first top three elements, the market, the technology, and the IP, is the things that need to be inherently in the company. And then we like to work very proactively with the company to try to develop the other aspects around commercialization, team, and the financing strategy. An example of that is an investment that I closed in the last few months called ACDOT, which is a Cambridge-based spin-out. It's an encapsulation technology, some great academics behind it, and it has some very compelling different markets. And when working with them, we worked with them very closely over a period of 18 months, actually, before we even did the seed funding round, in order to fully develop that commercialization strategy. What was the team going to look like? How was the team going to develop over time? And then what would that financing strategy look like? So at this point, I'll wrap it up, and I think we're out of time, but thank you very much.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Kelsey. Do you have a question for her? But you need a microphone.
Thank you. Kelsey, you said you had a problem with companies that license out IP to third-party production units. What about the other way around? If the IP, if the investment vehicle is the production company and is licensing from a topco that holds the IP?
It's a really good question, and I think you guys could all hear it, but kind of at what point are we comfortable with technology being licensed and in which directions? I want to be very careful to not make any blanket statements, because to begin with, there are situations in which I'm comfortable investing in a spin-out that then licenses, and ARM here in the UK is a great example, and Dolby, the headphones, great examples of companies that have made the licensing technology work very well. But in general, I think there's a lot of risks associated with it. On the flip side, I'm actually generally more comfortable with that. I think I would prefer to invest in a company that is producing a product and therefore has control over what that product is, what is the go-to-market strategy, what is the pricing, you know, driving it forward. Because often if the technology is licensed into a large corporate, you don't know really how much that corporate wants to commercialize the technology, and if you're just sitting and waiting for those revenues. I would say the only caveat to that is, of course, the terms around which the technology is licensed into the production company. If those are too laborious, then that can cause a problem. But since we're on the topic of university spinouts, I will mention a really creative structure that I just saw in the last couple of weeks, where the university had a royalty stream that was a bit high, and there was a discussion between the venture investors and the university where the venture investors felt it might hamper the long-term potential of the company to be acquired with this, you know, everlasting royalty stream. And so they came to an agreement where the royalty stream would exist until the company was acquired, and if the university then got some return from the acquisition, they would drop the royalty significantly. So it kind of created this win-win structure that I thought was quite creative.
Okay, great. Ben, one more question.
Kelsey, how important is the sector, I guess, that we're here today for, whatever you want to call it, to Imperial Innovations? And it sounds like your exits are principally IPOs. If you can confirm that, and whether you think this sector, whatever it's called, the nature of it is different, that it would lend itself less to IPOs and more to other kind of exits. Sorry. Yeah.
I appreciate your question. Thank you. Those are both really good questions. So to begin with, I attempted to flip back a few slides to the one that had the sectors, but I think they're trying to encourage me off stage. They won't let me change the slides. So I actually I thought about referencing in my talk. So many of the technologies here do fall into energy, but the sectors are not nearly as clearly defined as these circles make them out to be. So energy, materials, software, and then even to some extent communications and digital. I would say this conference represents technologies among that entire spectrum. So I think that sector, broadly defined, is very important to Imperial Innovations. My team, which is the technology team, spends I would say certainly 2, 3. I think our top 3 assets on my team are all fit into that category. So we care a lot about it. We also recognize that it comes with some challenges, particularly around go-to-market strategy. How much does the customer want it? The financing needs. And so my comments do come specifically from investing in that sector. And when I was in California, I invested in clean tech as well. So we care a lot about it and are aware that there are areas that are challenging. With regards to your IPO question, it's a very good one. We fundamentally focus on building strong companies. And if they get acquired along the way and we think it's a win-win, then we'll definitely go the acquisition route. I personally think it's very difficult to build a company for acquisition. And it's quite dangerous, actually, because that's something you as a spin-out or you as the startup, you cannot control whether or not somebody wants to acquire you. And so if you're like, plan year 5, you're going to get acquired, and year 5 comes and you don't get acquired, and you don't have a plan or financing strategy beyond that, it can be a real challenge. And so we focus on just building, the fundamental business, good revenues, good profit, and then that provides a number of different opportunities down the road, whether it's acquisition or IPO.
All right, super. Thank you very much, Kelsey.
Thank you.
Super. I need this one.